The wagon wheels groaned against the sun-baked earth as Sarah Mackenzie clutched her swollen belly, each jolt sending waves of pain through her exhausted body. The Texas plains stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of brown grass and scattered mesquite under the merciless August sun. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her late husband, James. "Mrs. Mackenzie, you're slowing us down again," called out Ezra Hutchins, the wagon master, his voice carrying the weight of frustration and barely concealed contempt. His weathered face was set in hard lines as he rode his chestnut mare alongside her rickety wagon. "The others are talking." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the reins tighter. The mule pulling her wagon was as worn as she was, its ribs showing through patchy hide. She knew what the other families whispered around their evening fires, that a pregnant widow with no money and few supplies was dead weight on a journey where every day meant life or death. "I can keep up, Mr. Hutchins," she managed, though her voice cracked with exhaustion. "Just need to rest the mule for a spell." "Rest?" Hutchins spat tobacco juice into the dust. "We got Comanche country ahead, and winter coming fast. Can't afford to coddle every—" He caught himself, but Sarah heard the unspoken word hanging in the air like vultures. Behind them, the Weatherby family's wagon rolled past without slowing. Martha Weatherby's eyes met Sarah's for a brief moment before she looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Their two young sons peered over the wagon's edge, their faces curious, but quickly pulled back by their mother's sharp command. The pain in Sarah's back intensified, and she doubled over slightly. The baby had been restless all morning, kicking with an urgency that frightened her. At 7 months along, she knew she was still too early, but out here on the frontier, there were no doctors, no midwives, only the harsh reality of survival. "I buried my James not 3 months past," she whispered to herself, touching the simple gold band on her finger. "He'd died of fever, just as their small farm outside Austin began to show promise. The drought that followed had killed their crops, and the bank had taken everything else. This wagon train heading to California was supposed to be her salvation, a chance to start over where no one knew her story." As the afternoon wore on, the other wagons began to pull further ahead. The Kowalski family, the Pattersons, even old Henrik with his cart full of mining equipment, they all maintained the steady pace that survival demanded. Sarah's mule stumbled, nearly sending her tumbling from the wagon seat. "Easy, Bessie," she murmured, though she could see the animal was at its limit. The water barrel on her wagon was nearly empty, and her meager food supplies wouldn't last another week. When the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Hutchins rode back to her position at the rear of the column. His expression was grave, and Sarah's heart sank before he even spoke. "Mrs. Mackenzie, we need to talk." He dismounted and walked alongside her wagon. "The group's decided, well, they've decided you can't continue with us." Sarah's world tilted. "What do you mean?" "You're holding us back, and with winter coming." Hutchins removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "There's a trading post about 10 miles north of here, McCready's post. You might find someone there willing to help, or at least shelter until—" "Until what?" Sarah's voice rose, panic edging her words. "Until I die, until my baby dies." "That's not my concern anymore," Hutchins said, his voice hardening. "My job is to get these families to California alive. I can't sacrifice 23 people for one." The wagon train continued moving as they spoke, and Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't a discussion, it was a pronouncement. Her hands shook as she looked ahead at the other wagons, at the people who had shared meals with her, who had listened to her stories about James, who had promised to look after each other on this treacherous journey. "Please," she whispered, but Hutchins was already mounting his horse. "There's a creek about 2 miles ahead where you can make camp tonight. McCready's post is due north from there. God help you, Mrs. Mackenzie, because I can't anymore." As the sun disappeared behind distant hills, Sarah found herself alone on the vast Texas plains. Her wagon stopped beside a thin stream that barely deserved the name creek. The silence was overwhelming after months of hearing the constant creak of wheels, the lowing of cattle, the voices of families settling in for the night. She unhitched Bessie and let the exhausted mule drink, then gathered enough dried buffalo chips for a small fire. As darkness fell, she sat beside the flickering flames, one hand on her belly, feeling the baby's movements growing more agitated. The coyotes were beginning their nightly chorus, and somewhere in the distance she thought she heard the sound of drums. But Chapter 2. The Council Fire Chief Ayana sat motionless atop his paint stallion, his dark eyes scanning the horizon where smoke rose in a thin column against the morning sky. Behind him, 12 of his finest warriors waited in similar silence, their horses shifting restlessly in the growing heat. The Kotsoteka band had been tracking the wagon train for 3 days, not to attack, but to ensure the white settlers continued moving through their territory without stopping to establish claims on Comanche land. Taibu, whispered Kicking Wolf, his war chief, using the Comanche word for white man. Only one wagon now. Ayana nodded, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. At 42 winters he had led his people through countless encounters with the encroaching settlers, always walking the thin line between protecting his band and avoiding the devastating conflicts that had destroyed other tribes. His graying braids were decorated with eagle feathers, earned through both war and wisdom, and the scar across his left cheek served as a reminder of harder times. The smoke was wrong. Too small for a wagon train, too steady for a grass fire. Something had changed. "We watch," Ayana said in Comanche, then switched to the broken English he'd learned during his captive years as a child. "Stay back. No show ourselves." They rode closer, staying low in the rolling terrain that provided natural cover. When they crested a small rise, Ayana saw the source of the smoke. A single wagon beside the creek, a lone figure hunched beside a dying fire. Even from this distance he could see it was a woman, and something about her posture spoke of defeat. "Easy prey," muttered Greyhawk, the youngest of the warriors, his hand already moving toward his war lance. "No." Ayana's voice carried absolute authority. "We watch more." Through his father's old army field glasses, taken in a raid years before, Ayana studied the scene below. The woman was young, with golden hair that caught the morning light. Her dress was simple but well made, though now stained with travel and hardship. What struck him most was her stillness. She sat like someone who had given up, like a wounded animal waiting for death. Then she moved, struggling to rise, and Ayana saw the reason for her abandonment. She was heavy with child, far along in her pregnancy. His jaw tightened as understanding dawned. The wagon train had left her to die. "Paha," breathed Running Bear, the band's medicine man who had insisted on accompanying this scouting party. The Comanche word for father carried layers of meaning, protection, responsibility, the sacred duty to defend those who could not defend themselves. Ayana lowered the field glasses. In his 30 years as a leader, he had made countless difficult decisions. He had ordered raids that brought back horses and supplies his people needed to survive. He had negotiated with Indian agents who spoke with forked tongues. He had watched his own children grow up in a world that grew smaller each year as the white settlers claimed more land. But this was different. This was a pregnant woman, abandoned and helpless. In Comanche culture, all children were sacred gifts from the Great Spirit, regardless of their parents' origins. He had been raised by a Comanche family after his own white parents were killed in a raid, and that act of mercy had shaped his entire life. "She dies today if we do nothing," Kicking Wolf observed pragmatically. "Sun is hot, no water left in wagon. Baby comes soon, I see signs." Ayana studied his warriors' faces. Some, like Greyhawk, saw only an enemy to be ignored or eliminated. Others, like Running Bear, seemed troubled by the woman's plight. Kicking Wolf remained neutral, waiting for his chief's decision as always. The woman below suddenly doubled over, crying out in pain that carried across the stillness. Even from their hidden position, they could see she was in distress. Her time was coming, and she was completely alone. "Go back to camp," Ayana ordered quietly. "Tell Bright Moon to prepare the birthing lodge. Tell her we bring woman who needs help." "Taibo woman?" Greyhawk's voice carried shock and anger. "Chief, the council will not understand. The elders will hear my words," Ayana cut him off. "This woman carries new life. That life is sacred no matter what blood flows in her veins." Kicking Wolf nodded slowly. "And if she dies? If child dies? The band will say you brought bad medicine into our camp. Then I will answer for that." Ayana turned his horse toward the creek. "But I will not let a pregnant woman die when I have power to help her. That is not the Comanche way. That is not my way." He rode down the slope alone, his weapons visible but his hands empty in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. The woman looked up at his approach, her blue eyes wide with terror. She tried to stand but stumbled, falling to her knees beside the cold ashes of her fire. "Please," she gasped in English, her voice hoarse with thirst and exhaustion. "Please don't hurt my baby." Ayana dismounted slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. Up close he could see she was younger than he'd thought, barely more than a girl herself. Her face was sunburned and drawn with pain, but there was still strength in her eyes, a fierce protective instinct that he recognized and respected. "No hurt," he said in his careful English, holding up both hands. "Help. Baby, come soon. You need help." Sarah stared at the Comanche chief, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She had heard countless stories of Comanche raids, of settlers killed or taken captive, but this man's eyes held no violence, only a strange compassion that made no sense in her terrified world. Another contraction hit her, stronger than before, and she cried out despite herself. When it passed, she found the chief kneeling beside her, offering a water skin. The liquid was cool and clean, the most blessed thing she had tasted in days. "My name, Ayana," he said slowly. "Mean, eternal blossom. You come with me. Women help with baby." Sarah looked around at the empty plains, at her dying mule and broken wagon, at the vast emptiness that had become her world. She had no choices left, only this impossible offer of help from the most unlikely source. "Sarah," she whispered, placing a trembling hand on her belly. "My name is Sarah Mackenzie." Ayana nodded gravely, as if they had just made a formal treaty. "Sarah Mackenzie, you come now. Baby not wait for Taibo ways." Chapter 3. Among strangers. The Comanche camp materialized from the prairie like a mirage, dozens of buffalo-hide teepees arranged in a careful circle beside a bend in the Brazos River. Sarah clung weakly to the travois that Ayana had constructed from lodge poles and buffalo hide, every bump and jostle sending fresh waves of pain through her laboring body. The baby seemed determined to arrive, contractions coming closer together with each passing hour. As they approached the camp's outer edge, Sarah became aware of the growing crowd of onlookers. Comanche men, women, and children emerged from their lodges, their faces displaying reactions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. The murmur of voices in their native tongue created an undercurrent of tension that made Sarah's skin crawl with fear. "Taibo Paraibo," she heard one warrior spit, white woman, the contempt in his voice clear despite the language barrier. Others pointed at her swollen belly, their expressions unreadable but somehow ominous. Ayana rode beside the travois, his presence the only thing standing between Sarah and the hostile crowd. When a group of young braves moved to block their path, he spoke sharply in Comanche, his tone brooking no argument. They stepped aside reluctantly, but their dark eyes followed Sarah's passage with undisguised anger. Where are you taking me?" Sarah gasped between contractions, her voice barely audible over the creak of the travois poles. "Bright Moon," Ayana replied, gesturing toward a large teepee, decorated with intricate beadwork and painted symbols. "Wife of my brother, killed last winter by Taibo soldiers. She knows birthing ways." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She was about to be helped by a woman whose husband had died at the hands of her own people. As they stopped before the painted lodge, a woman emerged who took Sarah's breath away. Bright Moon was perhaps 30 years old, with glossy black hair braided with silver ornaments and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Her buckskin dress was beautifully crafted, decorated with porcupine quills and small shells that caught the afternoon light. The two Comanche spoke rapidly, Bright Moon's gaze moving from Ayana to Sarah and back again. Sarah caught the word paha several times and saw Bright Moon's expression soften slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. "She says you bring much trouble," Ayana translated, "but baby is innocent of parents' sins. She will help." Without ceremony, Bright Moon and two other women lifted Sarah from the travois and carried her into the teepee. The interior was larger than Sarah had expected, with a fire pit in the center and comfortable buffalo robes arranged around the walls. The air was thick with the scent of sage and sweetgrass, medicinal herbs hanging in bundles from the lodge poles. As the women helped Sarah onto a soft pile of furs, she caught glimpses of the camp through the teepee's entrance. Warriors gathered in heated discussion, their gestures sharp and angry. She didn't need to understand their language to know they were debating her fate. "Kima," Bright Moon said firmly, pressing Sarah back down when she tried to sit up. The universal tone of maternal authority needed no translation. The next few hours passed in a haze of pain, foreign words, and gentle hands. Bright Moon proved to be as skilled as any doctor Sarah had ever known, her touch sure and confident as she monitored the baby's progress. 2 elderly women assisted, chanting softly in Comanche while burning herbs that filled the lodge with aromatic smoke. As labor intensified, Sarah found herself crying out, not just in pain, but in fear. "James," she sobbed, calling for her dead husband. "Oh God, James, I need you." Bright Moon's weathered hand touched Sarah's forehead, and she spoke softly in English, broken but understandable. "Husband, gone to spirit world. You strong. Baby needs strong mother." "You speak English?" Sarah gasped. "Little. Learn from my man before soldiers kill him." Pain flickered across Bright Moon's face. "He say, white people not all bad. Some have good hearts. Maybe he right." Outside, the sound of raised voices grew louder. Sarah could hear Ayana's deep tones rising above the others, authoritative but strained. The debate was growing more heated. "What are they saying?" Sarah asked, during a brief respite between contractions. Bright Moon's expression darkened. "Some warriors say you bring bad medicine. Say Chief makes mistake helping Taibo woman. They want—" She paused, searching for words. "They want you gone before baby born." "And Ayana?" "He say all babies sacred to Great Spirit. He say he not turn back on woman in need." Bright Moon met Sarah's eyes directly. "He good man. But this very hard choice for him." Another massive contraction hit, and Sarah screamed despite her efforts to stay quiet. When it passed, she was dimly aware of footsteps approaching the teepee entrance. Bright Moon called out sharply in Comanche, clearly forbidding entry, but an authoritative male voice responded. "Council calls for Chief," Bright Moon translated, her face grim. "They want him to answer for his actions now." Through the teepee's entrance, Sarah could see Ayana hesitating, torn between his duty to his people and his commitment to helping her. The moment stretched taut as another wave of voices rose from the gathering crowd. "Go," Sarah whispered, surprising herself with her strength. I'll be all right. Bright Moon will help me." Ayana nodded solemnly, but his eyes held a promise. "I come back. You and baby will be safe." As the chief strode toward the center of camp where the council fire blazed, Sarah felt another contraction building, stronger than any before. The baby was coming whether the Comanche wanted it or not, and she would have to trust in the mercy of strangers who had every reason to hate her. Fuditawantidas Chapter 4. The Council's Judgment. The council fire cast dancing shadows across the weathered faces of the tribal elders as Ayana took his place in the traditional circle. 12 of the band's most respected men sat in ceremonial positions, their expressions grave in the flickering light. Behind them, nearly every adult member of the band had gathered, forming a larger circle that stretched into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. White Buffalo, the eldest of the council and keeper of the band's sacred bundles, rose slowly to his feet. At 73 winters, his voice still carried the authority of a man who had led war parties against the Mexicans and seen the first white settlers cross Comanche lands. "My nephew," White Buffalo began, using the formal address that acknowledged Ayana's leadership while asserting his own elder status. "You bring division to our people on a night when we should be united. Explain your actions." Ayana stood, his tall frame imposing even among the seasoned warriors around him. He wore his finest ceremonial shirt, decorated with scalp locks and battle honors, but his face showed the strain of the day's events. From across the camp, the sound of a woman's cry of pain drifted on the evening breeze. Sarah's labor was intensifying. "Honored grandfathers," Ayana began, addressing the council with proper respect, "I have brought a pregnant woman into our camp because she faced certain death, and her child would have died with her. This is what the spirits required of me." "Taibo woman!" spat Iron Lance, a war chief whose brother had died in a cavalry raid 2 summers before. "The same people who poison our streams, kill our buffalo, and steal our children. Why should we show mercy to them?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered tribe. Several warriors stood, their hands moving to their weapons in ritual displays of anger. Ayana remained calm, though Sarah's distant cries seemed to grow more urgent. "Because," Ayana said, his voice carrying across the circle, "we are not them. We do not abandon the helpless. We do not turn our backs on those who need protection. This is what makes us Numinu, the true people. Old Bear, the band's medicine man, leaned forward on his walking stick. His milky eyes, clouded with age, seemed to stare directly into Ayana's soul. You speak of protection, but what of our protection? What happens when the Taibo soldiers come looking for this woman? What happens when they learn we have her? They will not come, Ayana replied. She was abandoned by her own people, left to die on the prairie. They consider her already dead. You cannot know this, challenged Broken Arrow, a middle-aged warrior whose painted face bore the marks of recent mourning. My son died because we trusted Taibo words before. They speak with forked tongues, and now you bring one into our very camp. Another cry from the birthing lodge cut through the night air, longer and more desperate than before. Several of the women in the outer circle shifted restlessly, and Ayana saw maternal instincts warring with tribal loyalty on their faces. White Buffalo raised his hand for silence. The woman's child comes tonight. This cannot be undone. The question now is what we do with both of them when the sun rises. Send them away, Iron Lance declared immediately. Give them a horse and some food, but they cannot stay. Every day they remain puts our children at risk. Send them where? Asked Running Elk, a younger member of the council known for his thoughtful nature. The woman cannot travel. The baby will be newborn. You condemn them both to death as surely as if you drove a lance through their hearts. Better their death than the death of our people, Iron Lance shot back. How many of our children have died because we showed mercy to whites? How many of our women have wept because we trusted in their promises? Ayana listened to the debate with growing frustration. These were good men, his friends and advisors, but their hatred was blinding them to what he saw as a simple moral choice. Another scream from the birthing lodge decided him. Grandfathers, he said, his voice cutting through the arguments, I ask you to remember the story of my own adoption into this band. A hush fell over the gathering. Ayana rarely spoke of his origins, though everyone knew he had been born white and raised Comanche after his parents' death in a raid. 37 winters ago, Stone Wolf found a white child crying beside his murdered parents. Stone Wolf could have left that child to die. Many would have said it was justice. Instead, he brought me to this camp and Singing Bird raised me as her own son. Ayana's voice grew stronger. That act of mercy shaped my life and, through me, the life of this band. I stand before you now as your chief because Comanche hearts chose compassion over revenge. That was different, muttered Iron Lance, but his voice lacked conviction. How was it different? Ayana challenged. I was white. I was helpless. I was the child of people who might have killed Comanche in other battles, yet this band chose to see me as a child in need, not as an enemy. White Buffalo stroked his long braids thoughtfully. You ask us to extend the same mercy to this woman and her child. I ask you to remember who we are, Ayana replied. We are the people who take in orphans regardless of their birth. We are the people who share our last bit of food with hungry visitors. We are the people who honor all life as sacred. From the birthing lodge came the sound of increased activity, women's voices calling urgently in Comanche. Bright Moon appeared at the edge of the firelight, her face strained with effort and concern. She approached the council with obvious reluctance, breaking protocol in her desperation. Forgive me, honored ones, she said, bowing her head respectfully. But the Taibo woman, there are problems. The baby comes wrong way. I need help, but I also need to know, she looked directly at Ayana. I need to know if I should fight to save them both, or let the spirits decide. The brutal honesty of her question struck the council silent. Here was the moment of truth. Would they choose to help save two lives that hung in the balance, or would they stand by and let death solve their dilemma? White Buffalo rose slowly, his ancient joints creaking with the effort. For a long moment he stared into the fire, as if seeking wisdom in the dancing flames. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations. Bright Moon, he said formally, you will do everything in your power to save both mother and child. That is who we are. That is who we have always been. The old man turned to face Ayana directly. As for what happens after, that we will decide when the sun rises and we see what the night has brought us. Chapter 5. Dawn's Promise. The first pale light of dawn was creeping across the eastern sky when the cry of a newborn finally pierced the pre-dawn silence. Sarah collapsed back onto the buffalo robes, her body racked with exhaustion but flooded with relief as her baby's strong wails filled the birthing lodge. Through her tears, she saw Bright Moon lift a tiny, perfect form, slick with birth but unmistakably alive and healthy. Tweenur, Bright Moon whispered reverently, the Comanche word for baby carrying deep spiritual significance. She cleaned the infant with practiced hands, her movements gentle but efficient. Strong boy. He fights hard to come into world. Sarah reached out with trembling arms, and Bright Moon carefully placed the baby on her chest. The infant was smaller than Sarah had expected, but perfectly formed, with a shock of dark hair and blue eyes that seemed to look directly at her. In that moment, nothing else existed. Not the hostile tribe surrounding them, not the uncertain future, not even the memory of James's death. There was only this miracle, this new life that had emerged from so much loss. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "I'm your mama." Outside the lodge, the sound of the baby's cries had carried across the camp, and Sarah could hear voices rising in discussion. The council fire still burned, though many of the warriors had dozed fitfully through the long night, waiting for news. Bright Moon worked silently, tending to Sarah with herbs and warm water, but her face remained troubled. Through the tepee entrance, Sarah could see the sky growing lighter, and she knew that with sunrise would come the final decision about her fate and that of her newborn son. "They won't let us stay, will they?" Sarah asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. Bright Moon paused in her work, meeting Sarah's eyes with surprising compassion. "Some hearts are too full of old hurts to make room for new hope," she said carefully. "But baby is innocent. Even hard hearts know this." The entrance flap rustled, and Ayana appeared, his face drawn with exhaustion but his eyes immediately seeking the child in Sarah's arms. He approached slowly, as if uncertain of his welcome, and Sarah found herself studying his weathered features in the growing light. This man had risked everything to save her. His position, his people's unity, perhaps his own life. "Healthy?" he asked simply. "Very healthy," Sarah replied, adjusting the soft deerskin blanket that Bright Moon had wrapped around the baby. "Strong lungs, as you can hear." A ghost of a smile crossed Ayana's face. "Good. Strong voice means strong spirit." He knelt beside the buffalo robes, and Sarah was startled when he extended one calloused finger toward her son. The baby's tiny hand immediately grasped it, holding on with surprising strength. "In Comanche way," Ayana said softly, "first person outside family to touch newborn baby becomes, how you say, spiritual protector, guardian of child's path through life." Sarah's breath caught. "You want to be his guardian, if you permit, if you trust Comanche chief with Taibo baby's spirit." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Sarah was only beginning to understand. Outside, she could hear the camp stirring to life, dogs barking, children calling to each other, the sound of morning fires being rekindled. "What does it mean?" she asked. What would it mean for him? Ayana was quiet for a long moment, his finger still held captive by the baby's grip. "Means always he has place among Numenu if needed. Means someone always watches over his path, even from distance. Means..." He struggled with the English words. "Means he belongs to two worlds, and both will protect him." Sarah looked down at her son, this tiny life that had brought her both salvation and an impossible choice. In the distance, she could hear White Buffalo's voice calling the council to order, preparing for the final decision about their fate. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I trust you with his spirit." Ayana nodded solemnly, then spoke softly in Comanche, words that sounded like both prayer and promise. When he finished, he gently touched the baby's forehead with his thumb, marking an invisible symbol that Sarah sensed held deep significance. "What will you call him?" Ayana asked. Sarah had thought about names during the long months of pregnancy, but somehow none of the names she and James had discussed seemed right now. This child had been born into a world far different from what she had imagined, saved by the mercy of people she had been taught to fear. "Thomas," she said finally. "Thomas James Mackenzie. For my husband, but also..." She paused, looking at Ayana. "What is the Comanche word for hope?" "Tukeva," Ayana replied. "Then Thomas Tukeva Mackenzie," Sarah decided. "So he'll always remember that hope came from unexpected places." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them, and White Buffalo appeared at the lodge entrance, accompanied by several other council members. The old man's face was grave but not unkind as he surveyed the scene. The exhausted white woman, the newborn child, and their Comanche protector. "The council has reached its decision," White Buffalo announced formally. "Sarah Mackenzie, you have given birth in our camp, and your child has drawn his first breath under Comanche protection. By our laws, this creates obligations on both sides." Sarah's heart pounded as she waited for the verdict that would determine her son's future. "You cannot stay among us permanently," White Buffalo continued, and Sarah felt her hopes crashing. "The danger to our people is too great, and the differences between our ways too vast, but neither will we send a mother and newborn to certain death in the wilderness." The old chief paused, glancing at Ayana before continuing. "When the traveling moon comes, in 6 weeks' time, a trading party goes to Santa Fe. You will travel with them under our protection. There you can find your own people, make your own way in the world." 6 weeks. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Time for you to heal, for baby to grow strong, for both of you to prepare for the journey ahead," White Buffalo explained. "During this time you will live under Ayana's protection. You will learn our ways so you do not give offense, and you will remember that Comanche mercy is not given lightly." Sarah looked down at Thomas, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then up at Ayana, whose dark eyes held a promise she was beginning to understand. 6 weeks wasn't forever, but it was hope. It was a chance for her son to grow strong, for her to heal, and for both of them to find their path to whatever future awaited them. "I understand," she said formally, "and I thank you, all of you." White Buffalo nodded curtly, then surprised her by stepping closer to look at the baby. His weathered face softened almost imperceptibly as he studied the sleeping infant. "Strong child," he observed. "He will need that strength for the life ahead." The old man straightened, his ceremonial bearing returning. "Ayana, the woman and child are your responsibility. See that our trust is not misplaced." As the council members departed, Sarah found herself alone with Ayana and Bright Moon, cradling her son in the growing morning light. Through the lodge entrance, she could see the Comanche camp coming to life. Children running between the teepees, women tending cooking fires, men preparing for the day's hunting and scouting. It wasn't the life she had planned, and it wasn't the safety she had dreamed of, but it was a beginning. For the first time since James's death, Sarah felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. 6 weeks, she murmured, testing the words. 6 weeks to learn, Ayana corrected gently. 6 weeks to prepare. 6 weeks to give your son the strength he will need for whatever comes next. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was not just sanctuary, but education, a chance to learn from people who had survived against impossible odds, who had maintained their dignity and identity, despite overwhelming pressure to surrender both. As the sun rose fully over the Texas plains, casting golden light through the smoke hole of the birthing lodge, Sarah Mackenzie held her son close and began to plan for a future she had never imagined possible. She was no longer just a desperate widow fleeing west. She was a mother under Comanche protection, and that changed everything. The story of Thomas Tukeva Mackenzie was just beginning, and it would be unlike any story the frontier had ever seen.